Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Central Wisconsin Book Festival and this event with author Tinney Heath. My name is Eddie, and I'm one of the organizers of the festival. Before we begin this event, we want to recognize our supporters and sponsors. Support for the 2021 Central Wisconsin Book Festival was provided through the Community Arts Grant Program of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board, a state agency, the Community Foundation, and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. Support also provided in part by the Ware Law Firm, the Marathon County Public Library Foundation, Wisconsin Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Covantage Cares Foundation, the Portage County Public Library Foundation, McMillan Memorial Library, Wisconsin Public Radio, the Friends of the Marathon County Public Library, Marathon County Historical Society, Whitewater Music Hall, and Janke Bookstore. I think I've already mentioned that we'd like all the participants to remain muted. We are recording. It's up to you whether to have your camera on. So any questions you can submit through the chat, and my colleague Diane will save those probably for the end of Tinney's presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Tinney Sue Heath. Her background is in journalism, but it was very nearly in music instead. When she is not writing about medieval Italy, you'll probably find her playing medieval and Renaissance Italian music on a variety of peculiar early instruments. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin with her husband, but spends as much time in Italy as possible for research and other pleasures. Without further ado, go ahead, Tinney. Welcome.
Thank you, Eddie. Nice to be here. Hi, my name is Tinney Sue Heath, and I write historical fiction set in medieval Italian cities. I'm fascinated by Italy's turbulent Middle Ages, and I love learning about what Italy's great cities were like before the Renaissance. Some people think that historical fiction is just escapism, fun but not relevant to our lives today, but that's not how I see it at all. Human experience can change a lot over time, but human nature not so much. In fact, I find it reassuring to think about all the problems and calamities humanity has managed to survive over the centuries. In fact, if my writing has an overall theme, I think it would have to be human resilience. I have a picture to show you. So, oops. Eddie, we're going to need some help with this. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Eddie, are you there?
Yes. Okay. I think it should let you know, but otherwise.
Okay, I'll try again. That looks good. Thank you. Okay. Here are the two novels I've published so far. The first one, A Thing Done, takes place in Florence in 1216 and is based on the historical incident that triggered Florence's traumatic split between the Guelph and Ghibelline parties, a divide that haunted all of Italy for many generations afterwards. Oops, here's my arrow. My second book, Lady of the Seven Sons, a novel of the woman St. Francis called Brother, is the book I'll be talking about today. Here is its cover. And here is the version I just couldn't resist making, the gluten-free version of my cover. Let me introduce the book by reading you the book description. A powerful noblewoman or a humble follower of the holy man from Assisi, all the rules say Giacomo cannot be both, but rules are made to be broken. Rome, 1210. After tragedy shatters Giacomo's world, Francesco intervenes to save her sanity, her life, and her soul. She owes him everything. Her gratitude is boundless, but now she must thread her way between duty and faith, always striving to be worthy of Francesco's affectionate name for her, Brother Giacomo. No longer locked into the power struggle among Rome's noble families, still she cannot turn her back on her sons, her household, and Rome's poorest citizens who depend on her charity. As a woman, she is not free to share the brother's life of sacred poverty, begging for her daily bread. Nor is she destined for Clare's cloister. A new path, as yet unexplored and unsignposted, lies ahead for Giacomo dei Sette Soli. If she finds it, will she be brave enough to follow it? Based on a true story, this is a novel of one woman's stubborn quest for grace. I can manage a picture again. I also have a third book called Cantilena for Seven Voices, Dante's Women Speak. It's available free exclusively to people who subscribe to my monthly newsletter. I'll post the information on how to do that later in case anyone is interested. This book is a collection of character sketches and vignettes of women we know mostly or entirely through Dante's life and works. Before we get started on Lady of the Seven Suns, I'd just like to say a little bit about medieval Italian cities. Here is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's interpretation of an idyllic Italian city, Siena in this case, prosperous and busy, with people dancing, shops doing a brisk business, travelers and merchants coming and going, new buildings going up, all the activities of any city at peace. Cities were experiencing a growth spurt with people flooding in from the countryside to make their fortunes. Cities teemed with life and color and creativity and ambition and opportunity. But there was a reason for all those soaring defensive towers. Urban warfare was common. Cities were also crowded, dirty, noisy, chaotic, malodorous, pestilential, dangerous, and politically volatile. Fire, flood, and political exile all took their toll, as did illness, which spread rapidly in the city's crowded conditions. Wars broke out. Individuals and cities changed allegiances and then changed back again, and new religious movements sprang up everywhere. The church was omnipresent in people's lives, for good and ill. There was, in fact, never a dull moment, however much medieval people must sometimes have wished for one. So my stories unfold in the palazzos, the hovels, the towers, the churches, the narrow and winding streets of the medieval city. As for my characters, I have a special interest in medieval women's lives. Not so much the queens and empresses, but the ordinary women, rich and poor, saints and prostitutes, mothers, daughters, nuns, wives, mistresses. They all have their stories, yet history tells us very little about them. I love digging around in the footnotes to find out more. I even made this Pulp Fiction cover to illustrate just how much fun I find it to be. It's a kind of detective work I very much enjoy. Now I'd like to talk a little about my second novel, Lady of the Seven Suns. I'll be sharing some pictures with you and also a few short readings from the book, which is written in first person in Giacoma's voice. My main character, Giacomo de Sette Soli, was a Roman noblewoman who became a devoted friend and follower of Francesco, the man known to us today as Saint Francis of Assisi. She was well known in her own time, the early 13th century, but today most people have no idea who she was, even though she was beatified and is therefore the Blessed Giacomo. Giacomo is the Italian form of her name, but it's often Latinized into Jacoba or Jacopa, and you even see it as Jacqueline in some accounts. The Catholic Church celebrates her feast day in February. I learned of Giacoma's existence by chance, shortly before a planned vacation that included Assisi. If I remember correctly, I pulled her out of a footnote in a travel guide. Once I did hear about Giacomo, I read everything I could find about her to prepare for what was now going to be a research trip. I didn't find very much. Even a lot of the best known of all the thousands of books about Francesco don't mention her at all, and those that do tend to limit her to a paragraph or two. Yet I found myself fascinated by the idea that a powerful, wealthy widow with strong political connections and control over a great deal of property could somehow become fast friends with the barefoot holy man who was devoted to poverty as part of his efforts to live a gospel life. See if I can manage to share this. Ridiculous to this line. This is an allegorical fresco showing Francesco marrying Lady Poverty. It's by the Florentine artist Giotto, who was roughly contemporary with Dante, and it's in the Basilica in Assisi. Here's a short reading from my book, written as the whole book is in Giacoma's voice, where she muses about her unusual situation. The black benda, now faded to a dull charcoal, had become my main concession to mourning. I had left off the dismal dark-hued gowns. My goal now was to keep my clothing simple, without ornamentation, as close to the spirit of Francesco's and the brothers' habits as possible, though I did allow myself a bit of color to keep my spirits up. I still mourned Graziano. I would mourn him for the rest of my life, but I didn't need to prove that to anyone. So I wore what I pleased. If my noble friends and kinsmen were taken aback at my utilitarian clothing, and Graziano's family thought I should still be in full mourning, and Francesco's brothers in their turn disapproved of my bright colors, well, they would all simply have to make of it what they would. I was like a duck these days, a creature of both air and water, but not entirely of either, not a grand lady and not a humble friar, and yet something of each. If I ever figured out exactly what I was supposed to be, I would dress accordingly, and until then, I would waddle around like the duck I was. What we can piece together about Giacoma's life is this. She was born into a wealthy, noble Roman family, the Normanni, and married into an even more prominent family, the Frangipani. Her birth took place either in Rome or not far away. She may have been born in this castle, or at least its predecessor, in Torre Astura. She was widowed while young, which left her raising her two sons alone. She became a friend and benefactress to Francesco and the early Franciscan brothers. Many say that she was the first Franciscan tertiary, the principal of the Third Order. After Francesco's death, she moved from Rome to Assisi, where she lived for the rest of her life. She's buried in the crypt of the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, just across from Francesco's tomb. If you have ever visited his tomb, you have walked right past Giacoma's as you come down the stairs. She is the only layperson buried in the Basilica, and I suspect she may be the only woman, certainly the only woman contemporary with Francesco. Here is a fresco of Giacomo, painted several centuries after her death, still visible at the place in the Basilica where she was originally buried. Her remains were later relocated to their present home close to Francesco's own tomb. We don't know of any existing portraits of Giacomo made in her lifetime. This fresco portrait, painted in the Basilica by Simone Martini, is thought by most to be a picture of Santa Chiara, known to English speakers as St. Clair, but many believe it is instead a picture of Giacomo. In any case, although that picture would be as close to contemporary as we have, Simone Martini could not have seen either Francesco or Giacomo in person. Francesco died in 1226, Giacomo probably in 1239, and Martini painted his frescoes in the 1320s. Those historians who did write about Giacomo claimed that her marriage to Graziano Frangipani was a happy one, and I treated it as such in my book. Here's a reading from early in the book about her reaction to her husband's sudden death. Not so long ago, I would have gone to the kitchen to greet the guests and welcome them to my home. I would have inquired about their needs, asked for their prayers, and made sure they left with more than they expected. I would have made sure they knew their way around Rome well enough not to get into trouble, and if they did not, I would have provided a guide from among the members of my household, or hired a neighbor boy to accompany. Not long ago, I would have offered them overnight lodging, but not long ago I was a wife, happy in my state, and not a widow. Not a half-crazed, disheveled, sorrowing wreck of a woman who scarcely a month before had felt her world tear apart, black despair arriving in the form of the agitated messenger who brought me the news. How could Graziano have fallen from his horse? He rode brilliantly as he did everything else. He might have been a centaur, so perfectly did man and animal move together. He loved to ride and hunt on the forested land near our summer villa in Marino, only a few miles outside Rome. He knew every herb, every rock, every tree on that land. How could a branch reach out and hurl him to the ground? And how could he have been so broken that he failed to get up, failed to remount, failed even to live until I reached him, though I was riding all out on the fastest horse in our stable, hair and clothes flying, while Massimo and the others struggled to keep up with me. Yet he did fall, and he was broken, and I did not reach him in time to say goodbye. I ordered our people to chop down the tree and burn it then and there. They were not to dry it for firewood, but reduce it to ash immediately. I bound my hair, which Graziano had so loved, in the widow's black benda and swore an oath to him as he lay on his bier that no man would ever see it again while I lived. I gave the necessary orders for his burial, sent the messages that must be sent, did the things that had to be done. No priest had reached him in time to shrive him, nor to give his soul the comfort of the final anointing. Masses had to be bought, and I did not stint. Graziano's soul would not suffer in purgatory while I could aid him. Some murmured about my extravagance, but I paid them no heed. Inside, I was empty, but the outer Giacomo knew all the rules and procedures, all the proprieties. I, was famously efficient and capable, so I let her get on with it. I remember nothing from that time. Many members of my husband's august family and my own came forward to help me. I was not alone, and yet I had never been so alone in my life. Why is it we know so little of Giacomo? She must have been prominent in both Rome and Assisi in her time, and she was certainly important to Francesco, yet the first two church-sanctioned biographies of Francesco don't mention her at all. Some Franciscan researchers today believe that her omission from those and other writings was deliberate. The church was intensely uncomfortable with the idea of a Franciscan friar, and especially Francesco himself, having a close relationship with a woman. Platonic friendships between unrelated men and women were rare in those days and invited suspicion, at least for noble women, whose lives were constrained by medieval ideas of honor. And the church feared that including Giacomo in Francesco's story would encourage the friars to fraternize with women, which they very much wished to avoid. Francesco himself had written, "Let all brothers avoid evil glances and association with women. No one may counsel them, travel alone with them, or eat of the same dish with them." He even referred to women as honeyed poison, and he once said that there were only 2 women in the world whose faces he would recognize, since he otherwise kept his eyes averted from women. Those 2 women, scholars believe, were Chiara and Giacomo. Of course, the ones who don't mention Giacomo at all say he meant Chiara and his mother. But it wasn't possible to expunge Giacomo from the record entirely, because Francesco's earliest followers, especially Brother Leone and Brother Egidio, had written freely about her in their accounts of Francesco's life, and the church could hardly censor the writings of these earliest Franciscans. So when they couldn't avoid mentioning her, they did the next best thing and presented the main story about Francesco and Giacomo as a miracle. After all, miracles are far beyond petty suspicion and gossip. The setting for this miracle was the Portiuncola, the place where Francesco and his brothers lived in the plain below Assisi. The Portiuncola consisted of a tiny chapel and an infirmary surrounded by crude huts to house the brothers. The histories tell us that when Francesco was on his deathbed, he dictated a letter asking Giacomo to come to him and to bring things for his funeral, candles and cloth the color of ash for his shroud. The writers even relay the poignant detail that Francesco asked her to bring some of the almond sweets she used to make for him when he visited her in Rome. And here's where the story enters the realm of the miraculous, because we are told that before that letter was written, Giacomo heard a voice while she was praying, and it told her that it was time to go to Francesco and to bring those items, the cloth, the candles, the almond sweets. Francesco's messenger was almost ready to take the letter and travel to Rome to deliver it to Giacomo, a distance of some 80 miles as the crow flies, but much longer by foot in mountainous terrain. But before he could leave, the brothers heard a knock at the door. It was Giacomo, who had obeyed the voice and had come as quickly as she could, bearing all the items Francesco had requested. This caused some consternation among the brothers, because women were not allowed in the Portiuncola. But Francesco insisted on making an exception for the dear friend he affectionately called Brother Giacomo. Giacomo was present at Francesco's death, almond cakes and all. In fact, various Franciscan groups even today commemorate his passing with almond cookies. I once tried to make little almond cakes using only appropriately medieval ingredients, and I wound up with a bunch of sweet hockey pucks. So I suspect the Franciscans today are making use of somewhat more modern ingredients. And I have some pictures. Most depictions of Francesco's death, especially earlier ones, do not show a woman present. This fresco by Giotto in the upper part of the Basilica does not, for example. But there is a much later fresco on the outside wall of the infirmary, now called the Transitus Chapel, which is where his death actually took place. This fresco is by Domenico Bruschi, painted in 1886. It shows Giacomo's arrival at Francesco's deathbed. Some more recent painters have included her in their work as well, like this one. And this, getting way ahead of myself. And this one. Yeah. The other well-known story about Francesco and Giacomo has to do with Francesco and the brothers presenting Giacomo with a lamb. This creature, of course, symbolizes the innocence of the Lamb of God. It's a charming story, but it comes in many versions. Sometimes he's giving the lamb to Giacomo, sometimes to Chiara and her sisters, and sometimes to someone else altogether. This picture shows Chiara receiving a lamb from Francesco. Those who say it was Giacomo add that the sheep would nudge her awake in the morning so she would not sleep through Mass. I really couldn't resist playing with this one a little bit. Imagine a noble household in Rome suddenly finding themselves with a sheep in residence. I had quite a bit of fun with this idea. I'd like to read you a short section from the book about what living with a sheep might have been like. I drifted toward wakefulness, aware of a powerful odor of rancid wool. Either Procide had taken another step in her quest for ever more humble attire, or Lotario needed a bath. Cautiously, I opened one eye. A large, wet, glistening yet soulful sheep eye stared back at me, a handspan away from my face. That sort of thing could startle a person who wasn't used to it. I closed my eye and tried to breathe through my mouth. Lotario nudged my cheek with his warm nose, insistently. I groaned and turned onto my stomach, pulling the cover over my head. Lotario, you could have been a roast shoulder of lamb, studded with garlic, I muttered. He shoved his muzzle into my side emphatically. And parsley, lots of parsley. I curled up defensively and pulled away from him. He put his front legs on the edge of the bed and butted me, none too gently. Time to rise. It was a lot harder to argue with Lotario at this age than it had been when we first got him, or he first got us, depending on your point of view. With a nice sharp vinegar-based sauce. It's not too late. I sat up and glared at him. Unperturbed, he wandered off to see if I might, for once, have left something edible on my wash basin stand. Okay, let's go back to sharing the screen. After I wrote that scene, I realized I had no idea what a sheep's eye looks like up close. This is where it comes in handy to have writer friends. I know a writer who lives in Tasmania and runs a sheep ranch with her husband. I emailed her and asked for a description, and this is what greeted me when I opened my mail the next morning. Now I'd like to bring you along with me as I head off to Italy to learn everything I can about this elusive woman. I wanted to get a sense of the world she lived in, to help me fill in the many gaps left by written histories. I hope you'll enjoy seeing how this particular research trip evolved. First stop, Assisi. The first thing I learned was that even in Assisi, there aren't very many traces of Giacomo. We knew, though, that we would see her burial place in the Basilica of San Francesco, the massive two-level church that was constructed soon after Francesco's death. The building project was designed and headed by the controversial brother Elias, and Giacomo's money funded a lot of it. The basilica was always meant to house Francesco's remains, which had been temporarily interred in a church in the middle of Assisi. When we visited the basilica, we saw that fresco of Giacomo that I showed you before, as well as her tomb. The upper church is ornamented with a fresco cycle by Giotto on Francesco's life, and some believe that one of those frescoes depicts Giacomo. If you see the figure clad in red who is holding up one end of the bier as Francesco's body is being brought to San Damiano so that the sisters can say goodbye, that is the person they think might be Giacomo. And if you look carefully, you'll see what look like a couple of long blonde braids peeking out from behind her headgear. A note about, oh wait. I should do this first. And when we visited a bookstore dedicated to all things Franciscan at the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, I hit pay dirt. They actually had a biography of Giacomo. It's old and short, and it was written in French, which I can't read, but fortunately for me, it had been translated into Italian, which I can. That is this book. You'll notice that the picture on the cover is the fresco that we just looked at. Even this little book, though, is disappointingly light on detail, but it does cite surviving documents about Giacomo's family and some business transactions, which was helpful. A note about that church. Santa Maria degli Angeli is located at the foot of the hill where the old city of Assisi is perched. It's big and Baroque, and its main feature of interest to a medievalist is that it contains the Porziuncolo Chapel, still in its original location, but now with a huge church built around it. Let me show you a picture of that. This chapel was the center of the small scattering of huts where Francesco and the early brothers lived in the 13th century. The Transitus Chapel, which had been the infirmary in Francesco's time, is also preserved there. It's odd to see the tiny chapel swallowed up in today's huge church. Here we have the little Porziuncola, a very holy place to followers of St. Francis. And here it is in a picture that shows you its present surroundings. There's another church in Assisi, this one in Assisi proper, that played a big role in Francesco's life, as well as in the life of the city. That's the 12th century church of San Rufino, Assisi's cathedral. And I think it may be my favorite church in the whole world. Trust a medievalist to have a favorite church. I have a favorite castle too, but that's a story for another time. Here are a few details from San Rufino's facade. This sculpture figures in the book rather prominently. I'd like to leave this image up while I read you a short section from my book about Giacomo's reaction to the facade of that church when she visited Assisi for the first time. I leaned out the window and feasted on the magnificent church as the night retreated and the sky gradually brightened. Only one other palazzo, the one where Francesco's fair and devout young noblewoman had grown up, separated us from San Rufino at the end of the piazza. Its facade was a glorious explosion of intricately carved decorations, animals and birds, vines and flowers, saints and evangelists, Christ's Holy Mother with her infant at her breast, the saintly bishop himself, a she-wolf, griffins and lions, a king on his throne, all in the warm, rosy stone of the Umbrian hills that surrounded us, with enough added color to make it rich and real. Nothing in Rome had ever captured my imagination the way this church did. I had seen it for the first time the day before, at sunset, and it glowed with a fierce, ruddy fire that made me gasp. I fell in love with the three figures standing on the backs of strange animals, their arms extended to support the huge rose window. Something about those little men, straining to hold up that window for eternity, touched me deeply. They made me think of Francesco. While we were staying in Assisi, we rented an apartment on the piazza of San Rufino. The bells were deafening, and we could see that gorgeous ornate facade by looking out the window and to our left. A few doors down from us, right next to the church, was the home where Chiara grew up. It's now a shrine and open to the public. This is the sign that accompanies it. It means in this place rose the house where Saint Clare was born and passed her early childhood. Those bells must have been even louder for her. We could look down into the valley from the rooftops or down into the street and the piazza below, where several scenes in my book are set. I was so taken with our location that I used it for the book. When Giacomo first visits Assisi, she stays with a noble family, who I made up, who just happened to live in that exact location. Thus, I knew exactly what she would be seeing. My view of the cathedral was her view of the cathedral, despite the passage of 800 years. There's another small church in Assisi that charmed me. Little Santo Stefano was a church for the city's workers, with little decoration, no pretensions. Square and sturdy, it has stood unperturbed while the earthquakes that the area is so vulnerable to have caused other buildings nearby to crumble. It is said that these bells rang out spontaneously in the moment in which Francesco died. And we also visited San Damiano, the convent where Chiara and her sisters lived. To get there is a short and pleasant walk from Assisi through an olive grove, and here you see women harvesting olives that belong to the convent in the fall. Now you're looking down in the courtyard of San Damiano. And this is the entrance. You can look back along that path. Whoops, you kind of went past that quickly, but I'll go on. And this is a room inside. It, of course, did not have those fancy frescoes and things in Chiara's day, but this is a room where Chiara and her sisters slept, and it's probably the room in which Chiara died. Several scenes in my novel are set in San Damiano, as I tried to use a novelist's imagination to explore the relationship between Giacomo and Chiara, which is something I've never seen commented on in any history. It would be easy to get immersed in Assisi, and one could learn a lot there about Francesco and Chiara, but I was writing about Giacomo, and that meant going to Rome. In Rome, my first quest was to find the Septizonium. The Septizonium was an ancient monument constructed during the reign of Emperor Septimus Severus, and for a long time it was thought to have been Giacomo's home. In fact, the Sette Soli part of her name is derived from this building, which was at the time owned by her husband Graziano's family. Here's what it looked like in the 15th century, already in ruins. Strange as it may seem, in the Middle Ages, a lot of classical Roman ruins were incorporated into various noble families' enclaves. Even the Colosseum was in private hands, with homes and shops, and fortified areas. Remember that medieval cities were not particularly peaceful places. More recent scholarship suggests that Giacomo's home was likely right in the midst of the Circus Maximus, which had been the site of chariot races and public games in ancient Rome. By the 13th century, it was full of gardens, orchards, and even a mill. But since the Septizonium is associated with Giacomo, I would love to have seen it. Unfortunately, it isn't there anymore. Here I am gazing wistfully at where it used to be. It was in the 16th century that Pope Sixtus V had it dismantled and reused the valuable marble and travertine for other projects. Here is the thrifty Sixtus. To give you an idea of where the Septizonium was and the Circus Maximus still is, and they are right next to each other, here is a map showing the circus outlined in red. The Septizonium is located just north of the rounded end of the circus. This is quite close to the Colosseum, which was also in the hands of the Frangipani family in Giacomo's time. So I couldn't see the Septizonium. But when we went looking for Giacomo's actual home, we had better luck. The Circus Maximus is no longer a privately owned collection of buildings and gardens, of course. Now it's a tourist attraction and an occasional venue for rock concerts. But this little tower, little stub of a tower, still exists, and it may have been from an earlier and taller version of the tower that Giacomo could look out all across Rome from. Here it is from closer. While walking around the area, I noticed a street named after Giacomo's family, the Normanni. Somehow that made her seem a little closer. The first scene in my book takes place in St. Peter's Basilica. Here is what it looks like today. In about 1450, it looked more like this. And it was probably smaller and simpler yet back in Giacomo's time. Central to my scene was the way the saint's body was housed. In Giacomo's time, it was in an annular tomb, or a tomb with a circular corridor around the front. Pilgrims used to enter from one side and walk along the curving corridor until they reached the midpoint, where they could view the sacred tomb before proceeding along the corridor and exiting on the opposite side. St. Peter's isn't like that anymore, but I knew there was an annular tomb in the crypt of a small and very ancient church, the Church of Santa Prassede. So off we went to Santa Prassede to see it. Unfortunately, the crypt was closed, so we didn't get to. But Santa Prassede did have exquisite mosaics. Here's an example that especially appealed to me. It shows the Virgin flanked by Santa Prassede and her sister, Santa Pudentiana, and on our far left, it shows, with the square halo, because she was still alive at the time, a woman named Theodora Episcopa. Theodora was the mother of Pope Paschal I, who died in the year 824. I like the idea of the Pope honoring his mother. Prassede, incidentally, is the name of one of the minor characters in my book, and one I very much enjoyed writing. There was a historical Prassede who was indeed a follower of Francesco, but we don't know much about her. We do know she was a recluse. I decided to make her a rather eccentric little woman who loved to talk, which caused one reader to refer to her as the world's chattiest recluse. Here's a short reading introducing Prassede. The little woman in gray hovered around the outskirts of our group as we all talked at once, catching up on one another's news. I turned to her to see if she was in need of anything, but before I could speak, Francesco beckoned her over. She hurried forward, smiling up at me. I am not a tall woman, yet the top of her head was level with the base of my throat. Monna Giacomo, I've heard so much about you, she said breathlessly. I'm called Sister Prassede, and I'm a recluse from Grottaferrata, but now I want to be part of Father Francesco's movement. So when I found out he was coming here to Rome, I walked here myself so I could meet him. And the very minute I came through the gates, there he was. Well, not him exactly, but one of his brothers, so I knew it was a sign. And then the brother took me to Father Francesco, and we talked for a long time. And he said he wanted me to meet with you because you were his good friend and a virtuous woman, and you would make me welcome here in Rome. She paused for breath. This was a recluse? I hadn't heard such a deluge of words since the last time my sister-in-law visited. What could Francesco want me to do with this woman? She began again. And I also learned that Father Francesco is going to start an order for women back in Assisi, and I would like to go there and be part of it because I want to embrace holy poverty and help others and live a gospel life and nurse the lepers and beg for alms. And Francesco held up his hand. Sister, enough for now, he said, gently but firmly. One other stop in Rome was important to me. The church of San Francesco a Ripa is in the Trastevere section of Rome, which was probably Giacomo's original home district. San Francesco a Ripa has a special connection with Giacomo. What's there now is a much later building, but its origins are in a monastic complex on this spot where Giacomo arranged for Francesco and his brothers to lodge when they were in Rome. His cell is preserved, and visitors can request to see it, and with it, the black stone he used as a pillow. This was just one of the ways her fortune and her generosity helped the fledgling brotherhood. The sacristan who was our guide seemed very bored and taciturn at first, but when I mentioned Giacomo, his face lit up and he told me all sorts of things about her life in rapid-fire Italian, which I just about managed to follow. Apparently very few tourists have heard of her, and it surprised him that I had. The church even has a conference room named after her. By then, I was almost ready to rent it for no other reason than that name. Let me find you some pictures. After Rome, there was one more town I needed to visit. Cortona features in Francis May's popular book Under the Tuscan Sun, and it is a lovely town. It also has a fabulous Etruscan museum, but I was in Cortona to see the Church of San Francesco, which is only the second Franciscan church ever built, the first being the Basilica in Assisi. And this too was built by Brother Elias, the controversial brother whose turbulent life after Francesco's death would make for a fascinating book in its own right. One of the relics displayed in the church in Cortona is a beautifully embroidered cushion made for Francesco by Giacomo. It is displayed along with one of Francesco's habits. Some say the cushion, although probably not the fancy cover, supported his head while he was dying. And here's a closer look at Giacomo's handiwork. For me, it was a real thrill to be there face to face with something Giacomo had made with her own hands. A note here about Brother Elias. Although many now view him as a Judas figure whose ideas were antithetical to Francesco's pure vision for the brotherhood, others believe the order would not have survived without him. He was one of Francesco's earliest followers, and he became the first minister general of the Franciscan Brotherhood after Francesco himself, who chose to step down and hand over the leadership to Elias. It was Elias who announced Francesco's death to the world, Elias who caused the Basilica in Assisi to be built, and Elias who built this church. Oops, I'm messing it up again. It was also Elias, however, who was ousted from his position of authority by a vote of the Brotherhood, who was eventually estranged from the order and even excommunicated from the church, and who actually joined ranks with Emperor Frederick II and rode into battle at his side. He died days after being reconciled to the church, but he never re-entered the Brotherhood. I expect Franciscan scholars will be debating his role in the order's history for a long time to come. Elias is buried here in this church. I'd like to share a reading about Elias. In this scene, he and some other brothers have just arrived in Rome, and Giacomo has made them welcome. Elias chuckled. It's never an easy journey, Giacomo, but you make it worthwhile. I relished the compliment coming from him. Elias was the one of the lot of them who actually saw all the little things I did to make Francesco's path easier. Egidio and the others assumed I was like them, a joyful follower who never questioned Francesco's policies. But Elias and I, and Francesco himself, were made of more complex, more convoluted stuff. From time to time, I longed for Egidio's simplicity and kindness, and for Leone's gentle wisdom. But apparently those weren't part of my nature, and they weren't part of Elias's either. We would have to make do with cleverness and good intentions, and the deep love for Francesco that we shared. How do you make sure there's food, Elias? I asked. And how do you find safe places to stay? You know Francesco's thoughts about planning ahead. We simply eat what people offer us and sleep when we are tired. It's my role to do what you would do were you to travel with us. I make sure we arrive in towns where we know people whenever it's time to eat. And similarly, before it gets dark, I try to get us to some place where we can count on an offer of shelter. If Francesco realizes what I'm doing, he fights me on it. He stops to preach or pray or arbitrarily calls a halt to the day's travel in the middle of nowhere. But if I'm careful, and I'm getting subtler all the time, he doesn't notice. Do you not feel a need to let God provide? Don't you feel out of step with the others when you plan ahead? He shook his head. Giacomo, I'm the reason Francesco can be so trustful and innocent. Because I do what I do, Francesco can walk lightly through life, with things working out more often than not. You're no different from me, you know. He has friends in high places in the church because you do what you do. Oh, Francesco himself is the cause of that, Elias. Cardinal Giovanni believed Francesco is a living saint, and Cardinal Ugolino says he's never seen another man like him. Francesco is a saint, and the Cardinal's right. He'll never meet another man like him. There is no one else like Francesco. But those men gave him a hearing in the beginning because of you. Do you believe you sin by steering him in certain directions and making sure certain things happen? I had long been curious about this. It was plain enough what Elias was doing, but I didn't understand how it fit with Francesco's teachings. It may be that I do. I would love nothing more than to emulate Francesco in all things, but my nature will not permit it. And I've come to believe God led me to Francesco because we need each other. I need his goodness to keep me from sinking too far into pride, ambition, and the temptations of the world. And he needs my skills to free him to be the saint he is. My role is to make his role possible. I've reached peace with that. You mean Francesco can't be a saint by himself? By himself, he certainly can. Problem comes as he gathers more and more followers. They are the reason he needs our help, and I assure you, Francesco does need our help. He is no administrator. He is a leader of men, but he will never be an organizer of them. And back to that. Oh, I wanted to show you his face first. There's been some reconstruction done on Elias's skull. And so you may be looking at something very close to the actual face of Brother Elias. And back to that cushion for a moment. There's a brief reading from my book with Giacomo describing why she loves to embroider. You make altar cloths then? He asked respectfully. Yes, and vestments and veils for the chalice. But I had also made veils for my hair before I put on the benda, and I made cushion covers and other pretty things. I loved the art of it and the freedom to use as much color as I wanted. I loved creating spring, summer, and autumn flowers together on a single piece of linen, though they could not exist together in the world. I could stitch apples with strawberries, ripe cherries and cherry blossoms together. The beauty I could make with my needle was mine alone to plan and realize. And when I felt sad or troubled, I found it was almost as good as praying, sometimes better. So those were the main places we visited on the trail of Giacomo and her story: Assisi, Rome, and Cortona. I thought a lot about the differences between Assisi and Rome, since Giacomo had lived in both of those cities. Here's an excerpt where she talks about that. Everywhere Rome is hard, Assisi is soft. Rome's summer sun emerges harsh and aggressive, even before it fights its way up beyond the 7 hills. But Assisi's is mellow burnished gold, warm and gentle. Sunlight flashes on Rome's brilliant white marble, sometimes sudden and sharp enough to blind you. But in Assisi, it caresses pink and white stone and seduces the eye. Even the sounds are different. Rome's streets, with their hard surfaces, clatter and rattle, and the voices of people and animals and bells ring out clear and sharp, edgy, piercing. In Assisi, sounds wind their way down curving streets, merging with their own echoes, caught by the buildings and tossed whimsically in new directions until they fade away altogether. When the bells were still at last, the people inside the church and a blessed quiet reigned, I leaned my elbows on the windowsill and enjoyed my silent contemplation of Francesco's city, now fully blessed by his brother's son. And then there's also the trip between the two cities, a trip Francesco made many times, and we know that Giacomo made it at least once. I have assumed other earlier trips to Assisi as well. It was a challenging route, one a noblewoman would not travel without plenty of protection around her, armed guards and companions. And the more people and animals one traveled with, the longer it took. Here's an excerpt showing Giacomo eager to get to Assisi. She's losing patience with her massive traveling party, which includes Cardinal Ugolino, Francesco's friend and protector, who later became Pope Gregory IX. Cardinal Ugolino rode up beside me. We're making good time, don't you think, Monna Giacomo? He asked, smiling. I looked at him, incredulous. It was day 21 of the journey. The writer I sent from Rome to Francesco in Assisi the previous fall had made the trip in 4 days. True, we had arranged for a change of horse for him each day, and he and his hired man-at-arms were traveling light, unencumbered by carts and wagons and companions on foot. We, on the other hand, traveled with everything from men walking barefoot to palfreys who chafed at our sedate pace and felt the need to move as much as I did. We had been slowed by a broken cartwheel and then a lame horse. And the man who walked us alongside our pack animals insisted on lengthy pauses to let them rest. He was a brother wearing the scruffy gray habit, so fond of the animals that I suspected we'd be carrying them if he had his way. The March weather had been fine for the most part, yet we were only now getting into mountainous country. We hadn't even reached Trevi yet, though we would by nightfall. I was eager to see Francesco and the brothers, eager to revisit Assisi, eager to make an end to this plodding, tedious journey and arrive where I could take a bath, wash my hair, and eat something besides road food, which during Lent was even more uninspiring than usual. After this exchange, Giacomo and Ugolino ride ahead a little so they can talk privately. Ugolino is trying to persuade her to drop a legal action against the papacy, one that she had inherited from her husband involving a property dispute. These two clever negotiators wrangle for a while and finally hammer out a deal. Here's the rest of the chapter. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and we rode on in an easy silence. I thought perhaps I would like to play chess with this man one day. I had not seen more than a hint of the subtle maneuverings he was said to practice, and yet I had a feeling he would be a worthy opponent. We had long since lost sight of the rest of our caravan, and I was about to suggest we halt and let the others catch up to us, when we heard a violent rustling in the trees alongside the road. We reined in our horses as 5 men burst out of the woods just ahead of us, yelling and brandishing weapons. And to find out what happens next, I'm afraid you'll need to read the book. Let's see. So now you've come along with me to several places that are important in my book. And you've heard bits and pieces of Giacomo's story. There's one more thing I want to mention. I'm not the only person who has recently published a book about Giacomo. The other author and I found out about each other quite by accident. We've read and enjoyed each other's books, and we are amused at all the coincidences. We both live in Wisconsin, we're the same age, we both have journalism backgrounds, we belong to the same organization and met as a result of that. And we even both have minor characters with the same names. We each had a servant named Sabina and a physician named Marco. Let me see if I can show you about that. Here is her book. If you are interested in Giacomo, you may want to read both of our books. We know of at least one book club which chose to read both and compare them as a project. I suppose in the normal way of things, she and I should be competitors, but we didn't feel much like doing that, so we become friends instead. And I'm happy to recommend her book to you as well as my own. We've taken very different approaches, but I think that both are valid extrapolations from what little is actually known. And that brings me pretty much to the end of what I had to say about Giacomo today. If you want to reach me with further questions that occur to you later, or if you're interested in the newsletter or finding me in any of these other places, I'll leave this up for a little while. And you can take down any information you may want. So, Eddie, I think that's it. Are there questions?
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. I have not seen any questions come through in the chat, but now would be the time to submit those. I might have a couple of my own. Okay, one really random thing. I loved all the pictures that you had. That really brought it to life. And you know, to have those connections to all those places. The one that I thought was especially funny was there was a statue that looked like a lion eating someone's head. Was there a story behind that?
Yeah, it's a picture. It depicts a martyrdom situation from early days in Rome.
Okay.
And yeah. I had a scene in my book where when Francesco was preaching in the piazza there to a large crowd, he rested his hand on the man's head.
Oh,
And a little bit later, there's a scene where Elias, good old controversial brother Elias, walks out and he's going into the church and he rests his hand on the lion. So I just let people have some fun with that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's an interesting touch. I mean, yeah, when you're in Europe and you see all that history, it's just right there, layer upon layer. And that's really cool that you could integrate all of those things. That's the other thing I was thinking is one thing we lose in this format is you didn't hear all our reactions. I had several times when I was chuckling or smiling or nodding.
That makes me happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sure everyone else is kind of following along in the same way, but
I love these research trips, and I did just want to share it because it's so gratifying to watch the story unfold and deepen as you go. It's one of my favorite parts of writing historical fiction.
yeah, for sure. Anybody else have any questions? I mean, you can put it in the chat. Oh, okay. Kathy says, the book is wonderful. The pictures you shared brought the historical fiction to life.
Oh, thank you. That's nice. I'm glad the pictures helped. I didn't want to overdo it. I thought they would.
Okay, I'll jump in again. One other thing I didn't quite catch was the other historical figure, I think named Kiara.
Yes.
And it seemed like they had a friendship or something, but I wasn't sure what their relationship was with.
Well, I kind of had to make it up because I don't think anybody has explored what their relationship was, but there almost had to be one. Those being probably the two women who were closest to Francesco.
Okay.
And Chiara, St. Clair, was abbess at the San Damiano convent.
Mhm.
And certainly, Giacomo moved to Assisi after Francesco's death, so I can't imagine that they would not have known each other and known each other fairly well. I wanted to explore that because they took such different paths with their lives, and yet they were the two who were closest to Francis. That intrigued me. So.
Yeah, for sure. That was neat.
Well,
I don't see any other questions popping up.
nor do I.
I'm going to make a quick final plug for some things here. Again, just thank you everyone for attending and being part of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival. I am going to put a link in the chat here to a survey, so we would love it if everyone could click on that link and fill that out. That helps us plan for next year. And I'd also want to encourage you to come to any of the following events that you can. There's a few more today and several tomorrow, and then a couple on Sunday. So please take a look at the festival website if you can and see which other ones might interest you. Okay, and you can probably see the comments now, but I'll just read them out loud.
Okay.
So wonderful book, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And how did you? Oh, a question. Good. How did you get the pictures? Are they in books and you scanned them? So I'm not sure. Go ahead. How?
Well, a lot of the photographs were our travel photographs. As for the art pictures, they're available on a site called Wikimedia, and I've chosen only public domain images. These can be freely used and freely shared and freely referred to. Mm-hmm. I'm careful about that.
Yeah.
But Wikimedia is a wonderful source, although their search engine can be a little idiosyncratic sometimes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, awesome. Right. Survey link. Oh, and one more comment. They were wonderful. Enjoyed the talk very much. Okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I want to thank everybody for coming and listening. Yeah. I'm surprised there are so many of you, and that's a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Love the book and the presentation. Ciao. Yes, Elizabeth Phelps is another one of our local authors. So I'll give a quick shout out to her. Thanks for
Yes,
coming.
I know Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Have a great rest of your day.